The gunshot echoed through the small town of Redemption Creek, Montana, marking the end of Emmeline Montgomery's old life and the beginning of a nightmare she never could have imagined. Her husband's body hadn't even been laid to rest before the vultures began to circle, eager to claim what little she had left in this world. The year was 1878, and Emmeline stood trembling on the auction block in the dusty town square, her honey-brown hair falling in loose strands from her once neat bun. Just 3 days ago, she had been a respectable rancher's wife with a modest home and a future ahead of her. Now, at 23 years old, she was being sold off like cattle to cover her late husband's debts she hadn't even known existed until the banker came knocking the morning after the funeral. $50 for the widow Montgomery. Called out the auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with yellowing teeth and breath that reeked of whiskey even at 10 in the morning. A fine woman who can cook, clean, and keep a man's house in order. Who'll start the bidding at $50? Emmeline closed her eyes, fighting back tears of humiliation. This couldn't be happening, not in America, not in this century. Yet here she was, her husband William 6 feet under after a dispute with cattle rustlers had ended with a bullet in his chest, and the bank seizing everything they owned including, apparently, her. $50. Called a voice from the crowd. Emmeline forced her eyes open to see Tobias Blackwood, the owner of the local saloon, leering at her with undisguised lust. At 55, he was known for going through wives, like most men went through pairs of boots, working them to death or driving them to run away into the wilderness. 55, shouted another man, one of the miners whose face was perpetually blackened with coal dust. The price climbed steadily, each bid feeling like another nail in the coffin of Emmeline's freedom. The crowd had grown, drawn by the spectacle of a proper lady being sold off like property. Some women looked on with horror and pity, but none stepped forward to help. In Redemption Creek, surviving was hard enough without taking on someone else's burdens. $120, Tobias called out with finality, silencing the other bidders. He grinned, revealing several missing teeth. Time to come home, Mrs. Montgomery, or should I say, the soon-to-be Mrs. Blackwood. Emmeline's knees threatened to give way beneath her. She gripped the wooden post behind her, splinters digging into her palms. This couldn't be how her story ended. William had promised her a life of dignity when he'd brought her west from Boston 5 years ago. Though their marriage had been one of convenience rather than passion, he had been a decent man who had treated her with respect. 120 going once. The auctioneer called, already reaching for the gavel, going twice. $500. The deep voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife through butter. The townspeople parted, revealing a tall figure at the back of the gathering. Samuel Reed stood with his feet planted firmly in the dust, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his Stetson. He wasn't from Redemption Creek. Emmeline would have remembered a man like him, but something in his steady gaze made her breath catch in her throat. "Did you say $500, mister?" the auctioneer asked, his beady eyes widening at the unexpected sum. "I did." Samuel's voice remained level as he walked forward, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself in a fight but preferred not to. $500 for the lady's freedom. Tobias Blackwood spat on the ground. "This ain't about freedom, stranger. This is a debt auction. Whoever buys her gets her as a wife." Samuel's expression didn't change as he reached the foot of the auction block. His eyes, the color of a summer storm, met Emmeline's, and something unspoken passed between them. $500, he repeated, "and my name." He extended his hand toward her, palm up. "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm offering you a way out of this. My name, my protection, but your freedom. Will you take it?" Emmeline stared at his outstretched hand. She didn't know this man, didn't know what agreeing might mean. But looking into those steady eyes, she saw something she desperately needed in that moment: honesty. "The lady needs to decide quick," the auctioneer said, growing impatient. 500 from the stranger going once. Yes, Emmeline whispered, then found her voice. Yes, I accept. Samuel's hand closed around hers, warm and calloused from years of hard work. He helped her down from the auction block with a gentleness that belied his rough appearance. I object. Tobias stepped forward, his face mottled with rage. You can't just ride into town, and I believe I can, Samuel interrupted, reaching into his vest to withdraw a leather pouch. He counted out the money deliberately, placing it in the auctioneer's greedy hands. $500, paid in full. The auctioneer quickly counted the money, nodding with satisfaction. Sold to the stranger for $500. Samuel turned to Emmeline, keeping his voice low. I'm Samuel Reed. Do you have belongings you need to collect? Emmeline shook her head, fighting to keep her composure. The bank took everything. I have only what I'm wearing. A muscle tightened in Samuel's jaw, but he nodded. Then we should leave town. I have a wagon waiting. What about the marriage? The auctioneer called after them. Need a preacher to make it official. Samuel paused, turning back toward the crowd. We'll handle that ourselves. The lady deserves a proper ceremony, not a spectacle for your entertainment. He led Emmeline through the parting crowd, his hand at the small of her back, not possessive, but protective. Emmeline could feel the eyes of the townspeople following them, could hear the whispers starting already. Who was this stranger? Why would he pay such a sum for a woman he didn't know? At the edge of town, a wagon waited, hitched to two strong chestnut horses. A pack horse was tied to the back, loaded with supplies. Samuel helped Emmeline onto the wooden seat before climbing up beside her and taking the reins. I don't understand, Emmeline said as they pulled away from Redemption Creek, the dust of the town settling behind them. Why would you do this for a stranger? Samuel kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his profile strong against the backdrop of the Montana wilderness. No one deserves to be auctioned off like property, Mrs. Montgomery, not in this country, not in this century. But $500 is money well spent if it means one less injustice in this world. He glanced at her then, something unreadable in his expression. I'm taking you to my homestead about a day's ride from here. You'll be safe there while you decide what you want to do next. And the marriage? Emmeline asked, uncertain. That's entirely up to you, Samuel said simply. I meant what I said, my name and my protection, but your freedom. If you want the legal protection of marriage, we can arrange it. If not, I'll help you get wherever you want to go when you're ready. Emmeline studied him as the wagon rolled along the rutted trail. Samuel Reed was perhaps 35, his face weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. His dark hair curled slightly where it touched his collar, and his hands on the reins were strong and sure. Why would a man like you risk so much for someone you've never met? She pressed, needing to understand. Samuel was quiet for so long that Emmeline thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear over the rhythm of the horse's hooves. Because 5 years ago I couldn't save someone who needed saving, I won't make that mistake again. The simplicity of his answer silenced her questions. As the wagon continued west, leaving Redemption Creek far behind, Emmeline realized she was embarking on a journey with a man she knew nothing about except that when everyone else had been willing to watch her life be auctioned away, he alone had stepped forward. It wasn't much to build a future on. But it was more than she'd had an hour ago. The journey to Samuel's homestead took them through some of the most beautiful country Emmeline had ever seen. They followed a winding trail that hugged the base of mountains still capped with snow despite the May warmth. Wildflowers painted the meadows in splashes of purple, yellow, and blue, and the air was filled with the songs of birds returning for the summer. They stopped to rest the horses at midday beside a clear stream. Samuel efficiently set about making a small fire to brew coffee, his movements suggesting years of self-sufficient living. "Are you hungry?" he asked, offering her a package wrapped in waxed paper. "It's just dried meat and biscuits, I'm afraid." Emmeline accepted gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since the previous evening. Thank you for everything. Samuel nodded, pouring coffee into a tin cup for her. You've had a difficult few days. That's putting it mildly. Emmeline attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. A week ago, I was planning spring planting with my husband. Now he's dead, I've lost my home, and I'm traveling with a stranger who rescued me from being sold like a farm animal. Life can change in an instant out here, Samuel said, his voice soft. The West doesn't forgive mistakes or bad luck. William wasn't a bad man, Emmeline found herself saying, needing someone to understand. He brought me out from Boston after my parents died. It wasn't a love match, but he was decent to me. I don't understand how he could have left such debts. Samuel studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. Some men gamble, some drink, others make poor investments thinking they'll strike it rich. He never seemed the type. Emmeline shook her head. But then, I'm beginning to think I didn't know him as well as I thought. They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that could only exist between two people who had nothing to hide from each other because they shared no history. Tell me about your homestead, Emmeline said eventually, needing to focus on something other than her losses. Samuel's expression softened slightly. It's not much, about 80 acres with a small cabin I built myself. Good water from a spring that never runs dry, enough grazing land for my horses and a few cattle. I've put in a vegetable garden and some fruit trees that are just starting to bear. You live there alone, he nodded. Just me and the horses, and now you, for as long as you want to stay. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Samuel looked away, his gaze sweeping across the vast landscape. I've found that loneliness isn't about how many people are around you. Some of the loneliest times in my life were in crowded cities. There was a story there, Emmeline realized, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West carried their past like a private burden, rarely sharing the weight. They continued their journey as the afternoon wore on. Emmeline found herself growing more comfortable with the silent, steady man beside her. There was something reassuring about Samuel. Rita sensed that he was exactly what he appeared to be, with no hidden motives or secrets that would suddenly emerge to harm her. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Samuel guided the wagon up a gentle slope. At the crest, he stopped the horses and turned to her. There it is, he said simply. Home. Below them, nestled in a small valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, was a clearing with a sturdy log cabin. A corral stood nearby, and beyond that, a small barn. A stream curved around the property like a silver ribbon catching the last light of day. Fields of new grass stretched out on either side, dotted with wildflowers. It's beautiful, Emmeline breathed, genuinely impressed. Most frontier homes were little more than rough shelters against the elements, but Samuel had clearly put care and thought into creating something more permanent. Samuel clicked to the horses, and they made their way down into the valley. As they approached, Emmeline could see details that spoke of the years of work that had gone into the neat stack of firewood along the side of the cabin, the carefully tended garden plot, the smooth, worn path from the house to the barn. When they reached the yard, Samuel helped her down from the wagon. Let me take care of the horses, and then I'll show you inside. Emmeline stood in the yard, taking in her surroundings while Samuel unhitched the team and led them to water. The air here smelled of pine and earth, and growing things so different from the dusty, close smell of Redemption Creek. When Samuel returned, he carried her small carpet bag, the only possession the bank had allowed her to keep, containing a change of clothes and a few personal items. It isn't much, he said as he opened the cabin door, but it's solid and keeps out the weather. The cabin's interior was simple but surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a wooden rocking chair pulled up nearby. A table and 2 chairs stood in what served as a kitchen area, with shelves holding neatly arranged provisions. A curtain partially separated the main room from what Emmeline assumed was a sleeping area. You'll take the bed, Samuel said, following her gaze. I'll sleep by the fire. I can't put you out of your bed, Emmeline protested. You're not putting me anywhere, I'm offering. His tone was gentle but firm. You've been through enough without having to sleep on a hard floor. Emmeline felt tears threatening again, not from fear or grief this time, but from the simple kindness this man continued to show her. Thank you. Samuel busied himself building a fire in the hearth, giving her time to compose herself. Are you hungry? I can make us something simple for supper. Let me, Emmeline said quickly. It's the least I can do. Samuel looked up from the kindling he was arranging. You don't need to earn your keep here, Mrs. Montgomery. Emmeline, she corrected him. Please call me Emmeline, and I know I don't need to, but I'd like to be useful. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him. Emmeline then, and I'm Samuel, or Sam if you prefer. Samuel, she repeated, finding she preferred the full name. It suited him somehow, solid and straightforward, without pretense. He showed her where he kept provisions, and Emmeline set about making a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread. The familiar tasks helped settle her nerves, giving her hands something to do while her mind tried to make sense of the dramatic changes in her circumstances. They ate at the small table by lamplight, the shadows dancing on the log walls. Samuel ate with the quiet appreciation of a man accustomed to his own cooking, which made Emmeline smile despite everything. This is good, he said, breaking their comfortable silence. Been a while since I had a proper meal that I didn't have to cook myself. It's nothing special, Emmeline demurred. Out here, a hot meal you didn't have to make yourself is special enough. He finished his food and pushed back from the table. I'll need to check on the horses once more before turning in. Make yourself comfortable. When he'd gone, Emmeline washed their few dishes and then, with some hesitation, explored the sleeping area behind the curtain. The bed was a simple frame with a straw-filled mattress covered by several blankets and a patchwork quilt. A wooden chest stood at its foot, and a small table beside it held another lamp. She changed into her nightgown, the only other clothing she possessed besides the dress she'd been wearing when William was killed. The familiar fabric against her skin was a small comfort in a world that had turned upside down. When Samuel returned, she was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, her hair unpinned and falling in waves down her back. He paused in the doorway as if uncertain whether to enter his own home. I've made up a pallet for myself, he said, gesturing to a bedroll near the hearth. You should get some rest, it's been a long day. Emmeline nodded, rising from the chair. Samuel, she said before retreating behind the curtain, I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you did today. He shook his head. There's nothing to repay. Get some sleep, Emmeline. Things often look clearer in the morning light. She slipped behind the curtain, but sleep was long in coming. She lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place, the crackle of the fire, the occasional shifting of Samuel on his bedroll, the distant calling of a night bird. Outside this cabin, her world had completely changed. Her husband was dead, her former life gone. She was now dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had risked his savings and reputation to rescue her. What kind of man did such a thing? And more importantly, what would happen next? As exhaustion finally claimed her, Emmeline's last thought was that for the first time since William's death, she felt safe. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she could rest without fear. Emmeline woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the cabin. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she thought she was back in her own home with William. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The light filtering through the small window told her it was early morning. She could hear Samuel moving quietly around the main room, obviously trying not to disturb her. The consideration in that simple act brought a lump to her throat. She dressed quickly in her one remaining dress, wishing she had something fresher to wear, and finger-combed her hair before pinning it up as neatly as she could. Taking a deep breath, she pushed aside the curtain and stepped into the main room. Samuel stood at the small cook stove, a pan of bacon sizzling before him. He'd already set the table with 2 plates and cups. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. He turned, giving her a nod. "Morning. Hope the bacon didn't wake you. Coffee's ready if you'd like some." "Thank you." She poured herself a cup, grateful for the warmth between her hands. "You didn't have to cook. Seemed only fair since you made supper." He transferred the bacon to a plate and added it to the table, along with a loaf of bread. "It's not much of a breakfast, I'm afraid." "It's perfect," Emmeline assured him, taking a seat. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Samuel spoke again. "I need to ride into Willow Creek today. That's the nearest town, about 10 miles east. We need supplies, and you'll be needing some essentials." "I don't want to be a burden," Emmeline said quickly. "I can make do with what I have until I figure out what to do next." Samuel's gaze was steady. "You're not a burden, Emmeline, and one dress isn't making do its hardship. I won't have that under my roof." The quiet authority in his voice brooked no argument, yet there was nothing domineering about it. It was simply the practical assessment of a man used to taking care of problems directly. "Will you come with me?" he continued. "Or would you prefer to stay here and rest? Either way is fine." Emmeline considered. Part of her wanted nothing more than to stay in this quiet cabin, away from curious eyes and questions. But a stronger part recognized that hiding away wouldn't solve anything. "I'll come with you," she decided. "But Samuel, I can't let you spend more money on me." "You've already. I have what I need and more besides," he interrupted gently. "Money's no good buried in a jar when there are real needs to be met." After breakfast, they set out for Willow Creek in the wagon. The day was clear and bright, with a spring warmth that promised summer wasn't far away. Along the trail, Samuel pointed out landmarks and told her about the area which creeks never ran dry, where the best hunting could be found, which paths to avoid when the snow melted and turned the ground to mud. Emmeline found herself relaxing as they talked, drawn in by Samuel's quiet passion for the land he'd claimed as his own. It was clear he knew every inch of the territory and respected both its beauty and its dangers. "How long have you been here?" she asked as they crested a hill that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. 7 years, he replied. "Came out after the war looking for a fresh start, found this plot of land and knew it was where I was meant to be." "You fought in the war?" Emmeline asked, noting the faraway look that came into his eyes at the mention of it. Samuel nodded. "Union cavalry. Spent 4 years watching good men die for a cause most of them barely understood." He fell silent for a moment before adding, "But that's a long time ago now." Emmeline recognized the closing of a door. Like many veterans, Samuel clearly preferred not to dwell on those dark years. She respected his privacy and changed the subject. "Tell me about Willow Creek. What kind of place is it?" Samuel's expression lightened. "Small but decent." "About 30 families, a general store, blacksmith, small church. Nothing like the cities back east, of course, but the people are mostly honest and hardworking." "And what will you tell them about me?" Emmeline asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in her mind. "A strange woman suddenly appearing at your homestead will cause talk." Samuel considered this, his hands steady on the reins. "The truth, or as much of it as serves, that you're a widow who needed help and I offered it. The details of how we met aren't anyone's business but ours." "And the marriage," she pressed. "You offered your name as well as your protection." "That remains your choice," he said simply. "If you decide it would make things easier or safer for you, I'll stand by that offer. If not, I'll respect that too. Either way, you have a place with me for as long as you need it." His straightforward answer settled something in Emmeline's chest. There were no expectations, no hidden conditions to his help. Willow Creek came into view around midday, a small collection of wooden buildings along a single main street, with houses scattered behind them. It was indeed smaller than Redemption Creek, but it had a more settled, permanent feel to it. Samuel pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped Emmeline down. A bell jingled as they entered the shop, which was packed with goods of all descriptions from foodstuffs to fabric, tools to trinkets. A plump, cheerful woman looked up from behind the counter. Samuel Reid, as I live and breathe, haven't seen you in nearly a month. Hello, Mrs. Palmer, Samuel greeted her with a warmth Emmeline hadn't seen him show before. Been busy with spring planting. The woman's curious gaze shifted to Emmeline, her eyes widening slightly. And who might this be? This is Mrs. Emmeline Montgomery, Samuel said, his tone giving nothing away. She's staying at my place for a while. Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows shot up, but to her credit, she kept her reaction to a minimum. Is that so? Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Montgomery. Likewise, Mrs. Palmer, Emmeline replied, lifting her chin slightly. She might be at her lowest point, but she still had her dignity. Mrs. Montgomery needs some essentials, Samuel continued smoothly. Clothing, personal items, whatever a lady might require. I'd appreciate if you'd help her select what she needs while I see to my other business in town. Mrs. Palmer nodded, her expression softening. Of course, come with me, dear, we'll get you fixed right up. Samuel caught Emmeline's eye. Take whatever you need, I'll be back in about an hour. After he left, Mrs. Palmer led Emmeline to a section of the store where fabric, ready-made clothing, and women's necessities were displayed. Now then, the shopkeeper said, her voice gentle but direct. Samuel didn't give me much to go on, but I can tell when someone's had a rough time of it. Let's get you properly outfitted. Over the next hour, Emmeline selected several practical dresses, undergarments, a warm shawl, sturdy boots, and personal items she desperately needed. Mrs. Palmer was tactful but thorough, ensuring nothing essential was overlooked. He's a good man, you know, Mrs. Palmer said as she wrapped Emmeline's selections in brown paper. Samuel Reid keeps to himself mostly, but always the first to help when someone's in trouble, been that way since he arrived here. Yes, I'm beginning to see that, Emmeline replied cautiously. Mrs. Palmer studied her for a moment. Whatever brought you to his door, you couldn't have found a better protector in these parts. Not many men would take in a stranger, especially a woman alone. No, Emmeline agreed softly. Not many would. The bell over the door jingled, and Samuel returned, carrying a few packages of his own. He settled the bill without comment on the substantial pile of goods Emmeline had selected, though she had tried to be as modest in her choices as possible. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Emmeline noticed how the townspeople regarded Samuel with respect, but also a certain distance, as if they recognized something in him that set him apart. A few nodded greetings, and Samuel returned them, but there was none of the easy familiarity she might have expected in such a small community. On the ride back to the homestead, Samuel seemed lost in thought, responding to her questions with brief answers. The easy conversation of their morning journey had disappeared, replaced by a pensive silence that Emmeline was afraid to break. Finally, as the cabin came into view, she gathered her courage. "Have I done something to upset you?" Samuel looked startled. "No, why would you think that?" "You've barely spoken since we left town." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign he was wrestling with something. "It's not you. It's just been a while since I've had to consider what others might think or say. I'm not used to it anymore." They were curious about me, Emmeline guessed, naturally. A hint of a smile touched his lips. A confirmed bachelor suddenly appearing with a beautiful woman is bound to set tongues wagging. The casual compliment caught her off guard, bringing warmth to her cheeks. "I'm sorry if I've complicated your life." "Don't be," he said firmly. "Let people talk, it doesn't change anything." But Emmeline wasn't so sure. As they unloaded their purchases and settled back into the cabin, she couldn't help wondering what their unusual arrangement might cost Samuel in terms of his standing in the community. He'd already spent a small fortune to rescue her. She couldn't bear the thought of him losing his neighbor's respect as well. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Emmeline made a decision. "I think we should marry," she said quietly, watching Samuel's expression carefully. "Properly, I mean, in the church in Willow Creek with witnesses." Samuel looked up from the bridle he was mending, his hands going still. "Are you certain? You barely know me." "I know enough," Emmeline replied. I know you're a good man who saved me from a terrible fate. I know you've been nothing but honorable and kind, and I know that your reputation matters in a place like this, even if you pretend it doesn't." Samuel set aside his work, giving her his full attention. "Emmeline, marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, especially not for someone else's benefit. There are other ways to handle the gossip." "It's not just about the gossip," she admitted. "It's about having a place in the world again, about building something new from the ashes of what I lost." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not offering this out of mere gratitude, Samuel. I'm offering it because I think we might suit each other given time." For a long moment he said nothing, his gray eyes searching hers. Then, with a deliberateness that made her heart beat faster, he set aside his work and came to kneel before her chair. "I won't pretend I haven't thought about it," he said, his voice low. "But I need you to understand something. If we do this, it will be a real marriage in every way that matters. I don't believe in half measures or temporary arrangements. I would expect fidelity, honesty, and partnership." "As would I," Emmeline replied, her throat suddenly dry. "And in time," he continued, "I would hope for more between us than convenience or gratitude. I would hope for genuine affection, even love." The rawness of his honesty took her breath away. "I hope for that too." Samuel took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "Then if you're certain, Emmeline Montgomery, I would be honored to make you my wife. Not because of what others might think, but because I believe we could build a good life together." For the first time since William's death, Emmeline felt something like hope unfurling in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, "I believe that too." 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning bright with promise, Emmeline stood beside Samuel in the small white church in Willow Creek. She wore a new dress of pale blue calico, her honey-brown hair arranged in a simple but elegant style. Beside her, Samuel looked transformed in a clean black suit, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his usually weathered face freshly shaved. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with Reverend Thomas officiating and the curious but largely supportive townspeople filling the pews. Mrs. Palmer beamed from the front row, clearly having appointed herself Emmeline's champion in town. When Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger he'd ridden all the way to Helena to purchase. Emmeline felt a flutter of something that went beyond gratitude or practical consideration. There was a rightness to this moment that she hadn't expected to feel. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thomas declared. "You may kiss your bride." Samuel hesitated, his eyes meeting hers in silent question. Emmeline gave a small nod and he leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle but unmistakably real. It lasted only a moment, but it sealed their union in a way that the words and rings had not. Afterward, there was a small reception at the town hall, with food contributed by the local women and a few small gifts from well-wishers. Emmeline found herself welcomed into the community with a warmth she hadn't anticipated, especially from the other women who seemed relieved to have another female in their remote settlement. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel came to stand beside her where she was chatting with Mrs. Palmer and several other women. "Ready to head home?" he asked quietly. Home. The word carried new weight now. Emmeline nodded, making her goodbyes to the ladies. The ride back to the homestead was filled with a charged silence, both of them aware that they were returning not as rescuer and rescued, but as husband and wife. When they arrived, Samuel helped her down from the wagon with the same courtesy he always showed, but his touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. "I'll see to the horses," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Take your time settling in." Emmeline went inside, grateful for the moment alone to gather her thoughts. She changed from her wedding dress into a simpler one, unpinned her hair, and set about preparing a special supper for their first meal as a married couple. By the time Samuel came in from the barn, she had a stew simmering over the fire and fresh bread cooling on the table. He paused in the doorway, taking in the domestic scene with an expression that made her breath catch. "Something smells good," he said, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "Venison stew," she replied, "from the deer you brought home last week." They ate together as they had for the past 2 weeks, but there was a new awareness between them, an undercurrent of anticipation that made the simplest exchange charged with meaning. After they'd washed the dishes together, a routine they'd established early on, Samuel cleared his throat. "Emmeline, about tonight?" "Yes," she prompted when he hesitated. "I want you to know that nothing needs to happen that you're not ready for," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Marriage means different things to different people, and I won't assume." Emmeline crossed to him, placing her finger gently against his lips. "Samuel Reed, are you trying to tell me that you're willing to be married in name only?" His eyes held hers, serious and intent. "I'm trying to tell you that I respect you too much to rush what should develop naturally between a husband and wife." The simple dignity of his words moved her deeply. This man, who had already given her so much, was now offering her time to know him, to trust him, to perhaps even love him. "And if I told you I don't want to wait?" she asked softly, Samuel's breath caught. "I'd ask if you were certain." "I am." Emmeline stepped closer, resting her hands on his chest. "We're married now, Samuel, in the eyes of God and the law, and I want to be your wife in every sense." For a heartbeat, he remained perfectly still. Then his arms came around her, drawing her against him with a gentleness that belied the strength she could feel in his embrace. "Emmeline," he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. "I never thought to have this chance again to build a life with someone, to share my home and my days." "Nor did I," she admitted, lifting her face to his. "But here we are." When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the chaste peck in the church. This was a kiss that spoke of loneliness finally ended, of possibilities opening before them, of a hunger too long denied. Emmeline responded with a passion that surprised her, her arms twining around his neck as she yielded to the warmth spreading through her. Later, as moonlight spilled through the cabin window, casting silver shadows across the bed they now shared, Emmeline lay in the circle of Samuel's arms, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. Their bodies were still warm from lovemaking that had been both tender and passionate, revealing depths in Samuel she had only glimpsed before. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "More than all right," she assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I never expected this." "What, becoming a rancher's wife in the Montana Territory?" She smiled against his skin. "Finding comfort and pleasure with a man I barely knew a month ago." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes cruelly, sometimes wonderfully." "And sometimes both," Emmeline mused, thinking of how William's death had led her to this moment, to this man who had awakened feelings in her that her first marriage never had. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hand still moving in soothing circles on her skin. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, "about why I was in Redemption Creek that day." Emmeline shifted so she could see his face in the moonlight. "You don't have to explain." "I do," he insisted gently. "No secrets between us, that's the only way this works." She nodded, settling back against him to listen. "5 years ago," Samuel began, "my sister Elizabeth was widowed when her husband died in a mining accident in Colorado. She was left with debts and a young son to raise. Before I could reach her, the local authorities, if you could call them, that decided to sell her contract to pay off what was owed." Emmeline's heart clenched, "Like they tried to do with me." "Yes." His voice had hardened. "By the time I got there, she'd been sold to a man who owned a brothel in a mining camp. I tried to buy her freedom, but he refused, said she was worth more to him than any price I could offer." "What happened?" Emmeline asked softly, though she feared she knew the answer. "She died 6 months later. Pneumonia, they said, but really it was a broken spirit. Her son, my nephew, was sent to an orphanage. I found him eventually and brought him to live with me here, but he was never the same. Too much loss, too young. He died of fever 2 winters ago." Emmeline raised herself on one elbow to look at him, seeing the pain etched in the lines of his face. "Oh, Samuel, I'm so sorry." He met her gaze, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "When I heard about the auction in Redemption Creek, I knew I had to go. Couldn't save Elizabeth, but maybe I could stop it from happening to someone else." Understanding dawned like the breaking of a new day. "So when you saw me on that auction block, I saw a chance to right a wrong that's haunted me for years," he admitted. "But Emmeline, what I didn't expect was you, how strong you are, how much I would come to admire you in such a short time." She leaned down to kiss him, tasting the salt of tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Thank you for telling me, for trusting me with your pain." Samuel cradled her face in his hands. "No more secrets between us, that's my promise to you." "And mine to you," Emmeline whispered against his lips. They sealed this new understanding with kisses that soon rekindled the passion they had discovered in each other. This time, their lovemaking was slower, deeper. Each touch an affirmation of the bond forming between them, a bond built not just on physical desire or practical necessity, but on shared truth and growing trust. As dawn broke over the mountains, Emmeline Reed no longer Montgomery knew that while the path ahead might not be easy, she had found something precious and unexpected in the ruins of her old life. A chance to build something true and lasting with a man who saw her value when others would have sold it to the highest bidder. The weeks that followed their wedding marked a time of adjustment and discovery for Emmeline and Samuel. Spring blossomed fully into summer, bringing long days of work and warm evenings of quiet companionship. They fell into a rhythm together, each learning the other's habits and preferences, finding ways to meld their separate lives into one shared existence. Emmeline took to ranch life with a determination that impressed even Samuel. Though she had lived on William's small farm, she had never been fully involved in its operation. Now, she threw herself into learning everything about their homestead, from tending the vegetable garden to helping with the small herd of cattle Samuel maintained. "You don't have to do everything at once," Samuel told her one evening as she collapsed into a chair, exhausted from a day spent helping him mend fences. "The ranch was here before you came and it ran well enough." "But not as well as it could," Emmeline countered, massaging her sore hands. "Besides, I want to contribute. This is my home now, too." The word home still carried a special weight between them. Samuel's expression softened as he knelt before her, taking her blistered hands in his own calloused ones. "It is your home," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her palm. "But I didn't marry you for your labor, Emmeline. I married you because I saw something in you that I wanted in my life: your spirit, your kindness, your strength." Emmeline leaned forward to rest her forehead against his. "And I'm not working myself to exhaustion out of some misplaced sense of duty, Samuel. I'm doing it because I want this place to thrive for both of us." As June gave way to July, Emmeline discovered she had a particular talent for gardening. Under her care, the vegetable plot flourished, producing more than Samuel had ever managed on his own. She also started a small herb garden near the kitchen door, planting not just culinary herbs, but also medicinal ones she remembered from her mother's garden back in Boston. Samuel, meanwhile, taught her to ride properly, not side saddle as she had been trained, but astride, the way a woman needed to ride in the West if she was to be truly useful. Their first lesson ended with Emmeline tumbling into a creek, both of them laughing so hard they could barely breathe. "You're a natural," Samuel told her as they sat on the bank, letting the summer sun dry their clothes. "A few more weeks and you'll be able to outride half the men in the territory." Emmeline leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she hadn't known was possible. "Only if they're very poor riders," Samuel chuckled, his arm settling around her waist. "I'm proud of you, you know. Most Easterners never adapt to life out here." "I'm not most Easterners," she reminded him with a playful nudge, "and I have an excellent teacher." The physical aspect of their marriage deepened as well. What had begun as a tentative exploration on their wedding night had blossomed into a passionate connection that sometimes left them both breathless with wonder. Emmeline discovered desires she hadn't known she possessed, while Samuel showed a tenderness and consideration that made her feel cherished as well as desired. They were not without challenges, of course. Their different backgrounds sometimes led to misunderstandings or clashes of perspective. Samuel's years of solitude had left him set in his ways, while Emmeline's Eastern upbringing had instilled expectations that didn't always align with frontier realities. Their first real argument came in August, when Samuel announced his intention to ride out alone to check on a remote section of their property where he'd spotted signs of rustlers. "It's too dangerous," Emmeline insisted, fear making her voice sharper than she intended. "If there are rustlers, you should gather some of the other ranchers and go as a group." Samuel's jaw set in the stubborn line she was coming to recognize. "That would take days to organize, and by then the trail would be cold. I need to know what we're dealing with. And I need to know my husband isn't riding into an ambush," Emmeline shot back. "Is that so unreasonable?" "This is how things are done out here, Emmeline. You can't apply Eastern logic to Western problems." "It's not Eastern logic to want you alive," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. Something in her tone reached him where arguments had not. Samuel's expression softened, and he crossed the room to take her hands. "I've been looking after myself in this country for 7 years," he said gently. "I know the risks, and I know my capabilities." "I'm not questioning your abilities," Emmeline said, blinking back tears. "I'm telling you that I can't bear the thought of losing you the way I lost William to violence I might have prevented if I'd spoken up." Understanding dawned in Samuel's eyes. "You think you could have prevented William's death?" Emmeline nodded, the guilt she'd been carrying finally finding voice. "He told me about the threats from the rustlers, but I didn't take them seriously enough. I thought he was being overcautious. If I'd urged him to seek help instead of facing them alone—" "Stop," Samuel said firmly, drawing her into his arms. "William made his own choices, just as I make mine. But you're right about one thing: I haven't been considering how my decisions affect you now." He held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I'll wait and gather some men from neighboring ranches before checking the north section. It's the wiser course anyway." Relief flooded through Emmeline. "Thank you." "But," he added, tipping her face up to meet his gaze, "you need to understand that there will be times when I have to act quickly without consultation. That's the reality of life out here." "I know," she acknowledged. "I'm not asking you to change who you are or how you live. Just to remember that your life is tied to mine now, and I couldn't bear to lose you." The admission cost her something in pride, but Samuel's response, a kiss of such tender passion that it left her breathless, was worth the vulnerability. That night, as they lay tangled together in the aftermath of lovemaking that had been more intense than usual, fueled by the emotions of their argument and reconciliation, Samuel traced the curve of her cheek with his finger. "I've never had anyone worry about me before," he confessed softly. "Not since my mother died when I was 12. It's unfamiliar." Emmeline pressed a kiss to his chest right over his heart. "Well, get used to it, Samuel Reed, because I intend to worry about you for a very long time." His arms tightened around her. "I can live with that." As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the landscape, Emmeline and Samuel settled more deeply into their partnership. They rode together to check on the cattle, worked side by side to put up preserves for the winter, and spent evenings planning improvements to the homestead. One such evening in late September, as they sat by the fire discussing whether to expand the barn, Emmeline felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She paused mid-sentence, pressing a hand to her forehead. Samuel was immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "Just a little lightheaded," she assured him. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing, as became clear over the next few days. The dizziness returned, accompanied by a persistent nausea that was worst in the mornings. Emmeline tried to hide her symptoms, not wanting to worry Samuel, but he was too observant to be fooled for long. "You're ill," he said bluntly one morning when he found her retching behind the cabin. "We're riding to Willow Creek to see Dr. Harmon today." Emmeline shook her head, embarrassed at being caught in a moment of weakness. It's just a passing thing, I'll be fine. Samuel's expression was a mixture of concern and exasperation. Emmeline Reed, you've spent the last 3 months telling me not to be stubborn about my health and safety. Now it's your turn to listen. She had to smile at having her own arguments turned against her. Very well. But I'm sure it's nothing serious. The ride to Willow Creek was taken at a gentle pace, with Samuel watching her like a hawk for any sign of discomfort. Dr. Harmon, a gruff but competent physician who had trained back east before the war, received them immediately. After examining Emmeline and asking several pointed questions that made her blush, the doctor sat back with a satisfied expression. Well, Mrs. Reed, I'd say congratulations are in order. You're expecting a child likely due sometime in early spring. Emmeline stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. A child. She was going to have a baby. Samuel's baby. She turned to her husband, who had gone completely still, his face unreadable. Samuel, for a heartbeat, he didn't respond. Then, in a movement so swift it startled both her and the doctor, he was kneeling beside her chair, his hands gently cradling her face. A baby, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Our baby. The wonder in his eyes brought tears to Emmeline's. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Samuel said, pressing his forehead to hers. Overwhelmed, terrified, grateful beyond words. Dr. Harmon cleared his throat, reminding them they weren't alone. Mrs. Reed appears to be in excellent health, but pregnancy on the frontier is never easy. She'll need to take care, especially as winter approaches. Samuel nodded, his expression turning serious. We'll do whatever is necessary, doctor. Good, Harmon said briskly. I'll expect to see her monthly until the snow makes travel difficult, then again as soon as the passes clear in spring. Sooner if there are any concerns. They rode home in a daze of happiness mingled with apprehension. The news had shifted something fundamental between them, deepening their connection in a way neither had anticipated. I never thought I'd have a family again, Samuel admitted as they approached the homestead, the setting sun painting the cabin in warm, golden light. After losing Elizabeth and my nephew, I convinced myself it was better to be alone than to risk that kind of pain again. Emmeline reached across to touch his arm. And now, his smile was slow but radiant. Now I know that some risks are worth taking, that loving someone even with all the fear and vulnerability that comes with it is better than the safety of solitude. That night, Samuel held her with a new protectiveness, his hand resting gently over her still flat abdomen where their child was growing. Emmeline covered his hand with her own, marveling at how much her life had changed in the span of a few short months. From the auction block in Redemption Creek to this moment of pure joy, it was a journey she could never have imagined, yet one that felt somehow destined. The man breathing softly beside her, this cabin that had become her home, the child they had created together, all of it seemed like both miracle and inevitability. As autumn painted the landscape in brilliant golds and reds, Emmeline and Samuel prepared for the coming winter and the baby that would arrive with the spring thaw. Samuel threw himself into projects to make the cabin more comfortable, adding an extension that would serve as a proper bedroom for them and eventually a nursery for the baby, improving the insulation against the bitter Montana winters, building a cradle from pine he cut and seasoned himself. Emmeline, meanwhile, devoted herself to putting up as much food as possible, canning, drying, and preserving the bounty of their garden and Samuel's hunting. She also began making baby clothes, carefully repurposing fabric from her own dresses and linens Samuel traded for in town. You're nesting, Mrs. Palmer observed with a knowing smile when Emmeline visited the general store in October. It's what all mothers-to-be do, getting everything ready for the little one. Is it that obvious? Emmeline laughed, resting a hand on her middle where the first gentle swell of pregnancy was beginning to show. Plain as day, the shopkeeper confirmed. And it suits you. Motherhood will too, I expect. Emmeline blushed with pleasure at the compliment. I hope so. It's all so new and a bit frightening. Mrs. Palmer patted her hand reassuringly. That's normal too, but you've got a good man in Samuel Reed, and that makes all the difference. Yes, Emmeline agreed, thinking of how attentive Samuel had been since learning of the pregnancy, how he insisted on taking over the heavier chores, how his hand would often find its way to her growing belly, how his eyes followed her with a mixture of pride and protectiveness. I've been very fortunate. The first snow fell in November, earlier than usual according to Samuel. Emmeline woke one morning to find the world transformed, every branch and fence post outlined in pristine white. She stood at the cabin window, wrapped in a shawl, watching the continuing snowfall with a childlike wonder that made Samuel smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "Breathtaking," Emmeline agreed, leaning back against his solid warmth. "But a bit daunting, too. Will we be snowed in?" "Not from this storm," he assured her. "But there will be times this winter when we'll be cut off from town for a week or more at a stretch. That's why we've been preparing so diligently." Emmeline nodded, her hand automatically moving to her growing belly. At nearly 5 months along, she could feel the baby's movements, now little flutters and kicks that never failed to fill her with awe. "The baby's active this morning," she told Samuel, guiding his hand to the spot where their child was making its presence known. Samuel's breath caught as he felt the movement beneath his palm. "Strong," he murmured, "like its mother." Emmeline turned in his arms to face him, or its father. The months had changed Samuel as much as they had changed her. The reserve that had been so much a part of him when they first met had softened, revealing a capacity for tenderness and joy that she suspected had been buried since the tragedies that had marked his past. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "That I'm glad I was on that auction block in Redemption Creek," she answered honestly. "Not for the circumstances that put me there, but because it led me to you." Samuel's eyes darkened with emotion. "I rode into that town looking to right an old wrong. I never expected to find my future." Winter settled in earnest, bringing short days and long nights that Emmeline and Samuel spent in the cozy warmth of their improved cabin. The extension Samuel had built was finished just before the heavy snows came, giving them a proper bedroom with a larger bed and space for the baby's cradle. The main room, with its stone fireplace and sturdy table, became even more the heart of their home, a place for meals, for work, for quiet evenings of reading or conversation. Christmas approached, bringing with it a wistfulness for Emmeline, who had always celebrated the holiday with certain traditions in her Eastern upbringing. Samuel, she learned, hadn't properly observed Christmas since before the war. "It didn't seem worth the effort, being alone," he explained when she asked about his usual holiday practices. "I'd acknowledge the day, perhaps with a special meal or a drink to absent friends, but that was all." Determined to create new traditions together, Emmeline set about making their first Christmas as a family special, despite their isolation. She had Samuel bring in a small pine tree, which they decorated with strings of dried berries, pine cones dipped in beeswax, and paper ornaments she crafted from pages of old catalogs. "It's not quite what I was used to," she admitted as they admired their handiwork on Christmas Eve, "but I think it's perfect." Samuel slipped an arm around her waist, his free hand coming to rest on the firm roundness of her belly. "It is perfect. And next year will be even better, with the little one here to enjoy it." Christmas morning brought a surprise, a brief break in the weather that allowed a neighbor, Tom Larson, to make his way through the snow to deliver mail and packages that had been held in town. "Reverend Thomas asked me to check on all the outlying families," Tom explained as he stamped snow from his boots at their door. "Make sure everyone was managing the winter all right." "Very kind of you both," Samuel said, inviting the man in to warm himself by the fire while Emmeline prepared coffee. Among the items Tom had brought was a package from Mrs. Palmer, a soft knitted blanket for the baby in a delicate shade of yellow, since we don't yet know if it's a boy or girl, as her accompanying note explained. There was also a letter from Dr. Harmon inquiring after Emmeline's health and reminding her of precautions to take during the latter stages of pregnancy. But the most unexpected delivery was a small, carefully wrapped package addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Reed in an elegant hand Emmeline didn't recognize. Inside was a silver rattle, beautifully crafted and obviously expensive. "Who on earth?" Emmeline began, turning the gift over in her hands. Samuel examined the enclosed card, his expression softening. "It's from Judge Hollister and Helena. The note says to welcome the next generation of Reeds. May they inherit their parents' courage and compassion." "Judge Hollister?" Emmeline repeated, confused. "I don't believe I've heard you mention him before." A shadow crossed Samuel's face, that old guardedness briefly returning. "He's the man who helped me try to save my sister and later to find my nephew. He's been a friend when I needed one." Emmeline recognized there was more to the story, but with Tom Larson sitting at their table, now was not the time to press. Instead, she thanked their visitor and prepared a basket of preserved goods for him to take back to his own family, along with messages of gratitude for Mrs. Palmer and the others who had thought of them. After Tom departed, promising to visit again when weather permitted, Emmeline and Samuel enjoyed their Christmas dinner, a roast of venison Samuel had hunted earlier in the season, preserved vegetables from their garden, and a special apple cake Emmeline had saved ingredients to make. It was while they sat before the fire afterward, Samuel carving a small wooden horse as a belated Christmas gift for her, that Emmeline returned to the subject of Judge Hollister. "Will you tell me about him?" she asked gently. "He seems to think highly of you." Samuel's hands stilled on his work. For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question, but then he sighed and set the carving aside. "Nathan Hollister was the circuit judge in the Colorado Territory when my sister was sold to that brothel owner," he began, his voice low but steady. "I went to him for help, thinking the law would be on my side, but the local laws were flexible when it came to settling debts, especially where women were concerned." Emmeline reached for his hand, offering silent support as he continued. "Hollister was a good man caught in a bad system. He couldn't officially help me, but he did everything he could unofficially, gave me information, contacted people who might assist, even offered me money from his own pocket to try to buy Elizabeth's freedom. When that failed after she died, he helped me navigate the legal system to find my nephew." "He sounds like a remarkable person," Emmeline said softly. Samuel nodded. "He is. He spent the years since then working to change the laws that allowed what happened to Elizabeth. When I wrote to tell him about our marriage and the baby, I never expected him to remember us, let alone send such a gift." "Perhaps you made more of an impression than you realize," Emmeline suggested, squeezing his hand. "Your determination to save your sister, your commitment to your nephew, those are qualities that leave a mark on people." Samuel's eyes met hers, filled with a vulnerability he rarely showed. "I failed them both, Emmeline. For all my determination and commitment, I couldn't save either of them." "But you tried," she insisted. "You did everything humanly possible, and then, when you saw me in that auction, you channeled that same determination into saving someone you didn't even know." She placed his hand on her belly, where their child shifted beneath his touch. "You didn't fail, Samuel. You persevered until you could make a difference." Something in her words seemed to reach a place in him that had been wounded for too long. He drew her into his arms, holding her with a fierce tenderness that spoke more eloquently than words of his gratitude for her understanding. "I won't fail you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Either of you." "I know," Emmeline whispered against his neck. "Just as you must know that you're not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." Winter deepened, bringing storms that buried the homestead in snow and nights so cold that ice formed on the inside of the windows, despite the constantly burning fire. But within their snug cabin, Emmeline and Samuel created a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth and everything to do with the bonds growing between them. January brought a new development in Emmeline's pregnancy. The baby became noticeably more active, kicking and turning with an energy that sometimes kept her awake at night. Samuel would often wake to find her pacing the floor, one hand supporting her back, the other cradling her prominent belly. "Little one's restless tonight," he would observe, getting up to walk with her, his presence a comfort even when the discomfort couldn't be eased. "I think we have a future cattle driver on our hands," Emmeline joked one such night, "or perhaps a wild horse tamer." Samuel chuckled, his hand joining hers on her belly to feel the vigorous movements. "Whatever this child becomes, they'll be extraordinary. How could they not be with you as their mother?" Such moments of tenderness and intimacy filled their days and nights as winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring. By March, the snow was beginning to melt, creating muddy conditions that made travel difficult but not impossible. Dr. Harmon made a special trip out to check on Emmeline, now in her final month of pregnancy. "Everything looks to be progressing normally," he assured them after his examination. "The baby's positioned correctly, and you're in excellent health, Mrs. Reed. I'd say you can expect your new arrival within the next 2 to 3 weeks." Relief washed over both Emmeline and Samuel. Though they hadn't spoken of it openly, both had been concerned about the birth taking place so far from town, especially given the unpredictable spring weather. "Should we consider moving Emmeline closer to town until after the baby comes?" Samuel asked the doctor as they walked him to his horse. Dr. Harmon considered the question seriously. "It's not a bad idea, but at this stage, the journey itself might be more risky than staying put. Mrs. Reed is healthy, the pregnancy has been uncomplicated, and I've left supplies and instructions with both of you." He clasped Samuel's shoulder reassuringly. "Besides, you wouldn't be the first couple to welcome a child in these mountains without medical assistance. People have been doing it since long before doctors came to the territory." After the doctor departed, Samuel found Emmeline in the garden, where the first green shoots were beginning to emerge from the thawing soil. She was kneeling awkwardly, her belly making such positions difficult, planting early peas along a trellis he had built for her. "You heard what the doctor said about rest," he chided gently, helping her to her feet. "I've rested all winter," she protested, but without much conviction. The truth was, she tired easily now, her body heavy with child and the demands of pregnancy. Samuel led her to a bench he'd placed near the garden, where the afternoon sun provided warmth. "Indulge me," he said, sitting beside her. "These last few weeks are precious, just the two of us. Soon enough we'll be 3 and everything will change again." Emmeline leaned against him, content. "Are you nervous? About becoming a father?" "Terrified," he admitted with a rueful smile. "I was only beginning to learn how to be a husband, and now I need to figure out how to be a father too." "You're a wonderful husband," Emmeline assured him, lacing her fingers through his. "Far better than I ever dared hope for when I agreed to marry you." Samuel brought their joined hands to his lips. "It's easy to be a good husband to a woman like you." The simple sincerity of his words warmed her more than the spring sunshine. Over the months of their marriage, what had begun as a practical arrangement had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated, a love that had grown naturally from respect and shared experiences, from seeing each other at their best and worst, from building a life together day by day. "I love you, Samuel Reed," Emmeline said, the words coming easily now though they had taken months to first express. "More than I thought possible when you rescued me from that auction block." Samuel's eyes, so often guarded when they first met, were clear and open as they met hers. "And I love you, Emmeline Reed. You and our child are the greatest gifts I never thought to receive." The baby arrived on a clear April morning, after a labor that began just after midnight and progressed steadily through the pre-dawn hours. Samuel had sent word to Dr. Harmon when Emmeline's pains began, but the baby had its own timeline and wasn't waiting for medical assistance. Following the doctor's written instructions and drawing on knowledge passed down from his mother, who had helped at many births, Samuel supported Emmeline through each contraction, his calm presence anchoring her when the pain threatened to overwhelm. "You're doing beautifully," he encouraged as the sun began to rise, casting golden light through the cabin windows. "Just a little longer now." Emmeline, exhausted but determined, nodded, gathering her strength for the final stage of labor. When the urge to push became overwhelming, Samuel positioned himself to receive their child, his hands steady despite the emotion he felt. With a final, powerful effort, Emmeline brought their daughter into the world, a robust infant with a healthy cry and a shock of dark hair that immediately marked her as Samuel's child. "A girl," Samuel announced, his voice choked with wonder as he wrapped the newborn in the soft blanket Mrs. Palmer had sent. "We have a daughter, Emmeline." He placed the baby in Emmeline's arms, where she immediately quieted, blinking up at her mother with unfocused eyes. Emmeline traced a gentle finger over the perfect features, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Samuel sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Emmeline's shoulders, his free hand gently stroking his daughter's dark head. The three of them formed a perfect circle, a family created against all odds from the most unlikely beginning. "What shall we call her?" Samuel asked, unable to take his eyes off the tiny miracle they had created. Emmeline considered the small face that already showed hints of both her own features and Samuel's. "Elizabeth," she said softly, watching his expression. "After your sister, if that would be all right." Samuel's eyes filled with tears he made no attempt to hide. "Elizabeth," he repeated, the name a benediction on his lips. "It's perfect. Elizabeth Reed." Dr. Harmon arrived an hour later, finding the new family peacefully settled. He examined both mother and baby, pronouncing them in excellent health. "You did well, Reed," he told Samuel as they stepped outside to give Emmeline privacy to nurse the baby. "Not every man would have kept his head so well during childbirth." Samuel looked back at the cabin where his wife and daughter rested. "I had motivation to stay steady," he said simply. News of Elizabeth Reed's birth spread quickly through the scattered community. Over the following weeks, neighbors rode out to offer congratulations and small gifts for the baby: a handmade quilt, knitted booties, a tiny silver spoon from the Willow Creek congregation. Even Judge Hollister sent a letter of congratulations, along with a savings bond for Miss Elizabeth Reed's education when the time comes. His note to Samuel added, "You have built something precious from tragedy, my friend. There is no greater victory than that." As spring fully established itself, bringing new life to the land around them, Samuel and Emmeline adjusted to parenthood with the same determination and partnership that had characterized their marriage. The challenges were many sleepless nights, the constant demands of a newborn, the need to balance childcare with the work of the ranch, but they faced them together. One evening in late May, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Samuel found Emmeline on the porch, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her arms. He sat beside them on the bench he had built when Emmeline's pregnancy had made it difficult for her to enjoy the outdoors without a comfortable place to rest. "I've been thinking," he said, his arms settling around her shoulders. "About what happens next." Emmeline looked up at him, curious. "What do you mean, this place?" Samuel gestured to the homestead spread out before them. "It's good land, but 80 acres isn't enough if we want to build something that will support Elizabeth when she's grown, maybe even siblings for her someday." The casual mention of more children made Emmeline smile. "What are you suggesting?" Judge Hollister wrote that the Jenkins place to the north of us is coming up for sale, another 120 acres with good water rights. If we bought it, combined with what we have, we could have a real ranch, Emmeline finished for him. "Something substantial to pass on to our children." Samuel nodded, his expression earnest. "It would mean more work, probably hiring help eventually, but I think we could do it, together." Emmeline looked down at their sleeping daughter, then out at the land that had become her home, the garden she had expanded, the fruit trees beginning to blossom. the new calf pen Samuel had built in anticipation of growing their small herd. A year ago, she had stood trembling on an auction block, her future in the hands of strangers, her worth reduced to the coins in men's pockets. Now she sat on her own porch, her child in her arms, her husband beside her, planning a future that stretched out before them with limitless possibility. "Yes," she said, turning to meet Samuel's gaze. "Let's build something that will last." Samuel's smile was like the breaking of dawn, full of light and promise. He leaned forward to kiss her, then pressed his lips gently to Elizabeth's forehead. "I rode into Redemption Creek that day looking to right an old wrong," he said softly. "Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for." Emmeline rested her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like the golden light of the setting sun. "And I found a man brave enough to take my hand when everyone else was willing to sell me to the highest bidder." As twilight deepened around them, stars beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky, the small family remained on their porch, bound together by love that had grown from the most unexpected beginning, a love strong enough to heal past wounds, to build a home where once there had been only solitude, to transform an act of rescue into a lifetime of partnership. In the wild frontier where life was often harsh and unforgiving, Samuel and Emmeline Reed had found in each other not just survival, but flourishing. Not just a marriage of convenience, but a union of hearts. Not just a shelter from the world's cruelties, but a home where love could grow and multiply, spilling over from their full hearts to the child in their arms and to the generations that would follow. From the ashes of loss and desperation, they had built something beautiful, and enduring, a legacy of love that had begun with a courageous bid at an auction, and would continue long after their own story had become the stuff of family legend. "Thank you," Emmeline whispered, the words meant for Samuel but carrying beyond him to whatever fate or providence had brought them together. Samuel's arm tightened around her. "For what?" "For taking my hand that day, for giving me your name, for everything that followed." His answer was simple, encompassing all that had been and all that was yet to come. Always. 10 years passed, transforming the Reed homestead into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. What had begun as Samuel's modest 80 acres had expanded to over 500, with healthy herds of cattle, flourishing orchards, and fields of grain that stretched toward the mountains. The cabin, too, had grown. Samuel had added rooms as their family expanded, first a proper kitchen for Emmeline, then bedrooms for the children, and finally a study where business matters could be discussed away from little ears. Though larger and more comfortable, the home retained the warmth and character of the original cabin where their life together had begun. Elizabeth, now 10, had grown into a spirited girl with Samuel's dark hair and Emmeline's honey-brown eyes. She was joined by 2 brothers, James, 8, who had his mother's coloring but his father's quiet strength, and Thomas, 5, a mischievous child who kept them all on their toes with his adventures. On a bright September morning, as mist still clung to the valley floor, Emmeline stood on the porch watching Samuel and Elizabeth ride out to check on a new calf. Her daughter sat tall in the saddle on her own pony, her braid bouncing against her back as she kept pace with her father. "Mama, look." James called from the garden where he was helping to harvest the last of the summer vegetables. "The biggest potato yet," Emmeline smiled, crossing to where her son proudly held up a potato nearly the size of his head. "My goodness, that might feed us all for supper tonight. Can I help cook it?" he asked eagerly. James, unlike his adventurous siblings, preferred indoor activities and had recently developed an interest in helping Emmeline in the kitchen. "Of course you can," she assured him, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Where's your brother?" James rolled his eyes in the long, suffering manner of older siblings everywhere. "Talking to the chickens again. He thinks they understand him." "Perhaps they do," Emmeline said with a smile, looking toward the henhouse where, sure enough, Thomas could be seen earnestly conversing with the family's flock. These ordinary moments of family life never failed to fill Emmeline with gratitude. Each day brought its own small joys and challenges, but the life she and Samuel had built together was richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined when she stood on that auction block in Redemption Creek. The town itself was now a distant memory. They had heard that, after the railroad bypassed it in favor of larger settlements, Redemption Creek had slowly withered, many of its buildings abandoned as residents moved on to more promising locations. Whatever had become of Tobias Blackwood and the others who had been willing to buy and sell a woman's life, Emmeline neither knew nor cared to know. Her world was here, in this valley that had become home, with the family she and Samuel had created together. As if summoned by her thoughts, Samuel and Elizabeth came cantering back toward the house, both smiling with the simple joy of a morning ride together. "Mama," Elizabeth called as they approached, "Papa says I can help with the roundup this year, not just watching from the fence, really helping." Samuel dismounted, lifting his daughter down before turning to Emmeline with a slightly sheepish expression. "I said we'd discuss it," he clarified. "She's getting to be quite the horsewoman." "Just like her father," Emmeline observed, accepting his quick kiss in greeting. "We'll talk about it later," she added to Elizabeth, who beamed at not receiving an immediate refusal. The day unfolded with the comfortable rhythm they had established over the years. After the midday meal, while the younger children napped, Elizabeth practiced her reading with Emmeline. Samuel had insisted all their children receive a proper education, bringing in a tutor from Helena during the winter months and supplementing with their own instruction year-round. "Why did people think they could sell a woman at auction, Mama?" Elizabeth asked suddenly, looking up from her history book. "It says here that before the war there were slave auctions in the South, but that was for slaves. You weren't a slave." Emmeline set aside her mending, considering how to answer such a complex question for a 10-year-old. She and Samuel had never hidden the circumstances of their meeting from their children, believing that truth, appropriately framed, was always better than evasion. In some places, even after the war, women had very few rights of their own, she explained carefully. If a husband died leaving debts, sometimes his widow was considered part of his property that could be sold to pay those debts. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "That's horrible. Wasn't there a law against it?" "Laws aren't always just," Emmeline said gently. "And in frontier territories, they weren't always enforced the same way they were in more settled places." "Is that why Papa bought you? To save you from being sold to someone bad?" Emmeline smiled at her daughter's direct question. "Yes, that's exactly why. He saw something happening that he knew was wrong, and he stepped in to stop it." Elizabeth considered this, her young face serious. "I'm glad he did. Otherwise, you wouldn't be my mama." "And I wouldn't miss that for the world," Emmeline assured her, drawing her daughter close for a hug. That evening, after the children were asleep, Emmeline found Samuel in his study reviewing ledgers by lamplight. At 45, his dark hair was now streaked with silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But to Emmeline, he was more handsome than ever, his face now a map of their years together, of shared joys and weathered storms. "Elizabeth asked about the auction today," she said, perching on the edge of his desk. Samuel set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, as much as she could understand. That in some places, women had few rights and that you stepped in to prevent an injustice." Emmeline reached out to trace the line of his jaw, her touch gentle. "She said she was glad you did, or I wouldn't be her mother." Samuel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, a gesture that still had the power to quicken her heartbeat after all these years. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone to Redemption Creek that day. I try not to think about it," Emmeline admitted. "The alternatives are too grim." "Not for you," Samuel said with certainty. "You would have found a way to survive, to overcome. That strength was in you all along. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to witness it." Emmeline shook her head, smiling at his unwavering faith in her. "Perhaps, but I'm grateful every day that I didn't have to find out." She moved from the desk to sit on his lap, an intimacy that had become comfortable over their years together. Samuel's arms came around her automatically, holding her close. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Taking on a stranger's troubles, spending your savings, changing your entire life?" Samuel looked up at her, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight. "Emmeline Reed, in the 10 years since I put you on that wagon and brought you home, there hasn't been a single day, not one, when I've regretted what I did. Every sacrifice, every challenge, every change has been worth it 1,000 times over." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You and the children are the best things that ever happened to me. Without you, I'd still be a solitary man in a cabin, living half a life and not even knowing what I was missing." Emmeline leaned into his touch, her heart full. "I love you, Samuel, more now than I thought possible when we stood before Reverend Thomas and made our vows." "And I love you," he replied, drawing her down for a kiss that held all the passion of their early days together, tempered now by the deep understanding that comes only with years of shared life. "More than I have words to express." Later, as they lay together in the bedroom that had witnessed so much of their private joy over the years, Emmeline rested her head on Samuel's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the Montana night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast sky. Inside, warmth and contentment wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. "I had a letter from Judge Hollister today," Samuel said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of their wedding night that it brought a smile to Emmeline's lips. "He's retiring from the bench at the end of the year. Says he wants to spend his remaining years enjoying the changes he helped bring about rather than fighting for more. He's accomplished so much," Emmeline observed. "The laws protecting women's property rights after widowhood, the regulations on debt collection, those are his legacy." "He says we're part of his legacy too," Samuel told her. "That knowing what happened to Elizabeth, and then meeting us, seeing how different things could be, gave him the determination to keep pushing for change even when it seemed hopeless." Emmeline raised herself on one elbow to look at her husband's face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "He's right. What happened between us, a man standing up against injustice to protect a woman he didn't even know, that's the kind of story that changes hearts and eventually laws." Samuel tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Redemption Creek lately, about how things might have gone if someone had stood up for Elizabeth the way I tried to stand up for you. Is that why you've been corresponding with those legislators in Helena?" Emmeline asked, having noticed the increased mail from the territorial capital. Samuel nodded. "There's a bill being considered that would explicitly outlaw the practice of auctioning widows for their husbands' debts. It shouldn't be necessary, such auctions should already be illegal under existing law, but making it explicit leaves no room for local interpretations like what happened to you." "And to your sister," Emmeline added softly. "Yes." Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. "Too late for Elizabeth, but not too late for other women who might find themselves in similar circumstances." Emmeline laid her head back on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You're still saving women from auction blocks, Samuel Reed, just in a different way now." His arms tightened around her. "With a much better partner by my side." They fell silent, content in each other's embrace, the quiet of the night broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. Their lives had expanded in ways neither could have foreseen, from a desperate bargain struck on an auction block to a thriving family, a prosperous ranch, and now efforts to change the very laws that had nearly destroyed Emmeline's life. "We should invite Judge Hollister to visit when he retires," Emmeline suggested, already planning the details in her mind. "The children would love to meet him, especially Elizabeth. She's at an age to appreciate the stories he could tell." "I'd like that," Samuel agreed, his voice growing drowsy. He should see what his efforts helped create. As Samuel drifted toward sleep, Emmeline remained awake a little longer, her mind traveling back over the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the terrifying day when William was killed to the humiliation of the auction block, from Samuel's unexpected intervention to their careful building of trust and eventual love, each step had been necessary to create the life they now shared. Even the hardships, the difficult first winter, Samuel's injury 2 years ago when a frightened horse had kicked him, the drought that had nearly ruined them before the children were born, all of it had strengthened rather than weakened the bonds between them. "Thank you," she whispered against Samuel's skin, an echo of the gratitude she had expressed on their first night as a family, when Elizabeth was newborn and their future together still unwritten. Samuel stirred slightly, his arms tightening around her even in sleep, as if his body recognized her voice and responded automatically with protection and love. Emmeline closed her eyes, settling into the familiar comfort of her husband's embrace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, children to teach, a ranch to run, a community to serve. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the home they had built together, Emmeline Reed was simply grateful for the journey that had led her here to this man, this family, this life that had risen like a phoenix from the ashes of despair. From auction block to beloved wife and mother, from propertyless widow to respected rancher's partner, it was a transformation that spoke not just to her own resilience, but to the power of one person standing up against injustice, offering a hand instead of a hammer, a name instead of a price. In that simple, profound act of human decency, Samuel Reed had not only saved Emmeline's life, he had changed it immeasurably for the better. And in accepting his offer, in building a life with him day by day, choice by choice, Emmeline had helped heal the wounds of his past, giving him the family he had lost and the love he had never expected to find. Their story, which had begun with a desperate bargain, had become something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the possibility of new beginnings, of second chances, of love growing in the most unlikely soil. As Emmeline drifted finally into sleep, her last conscious thought was of gratitude, not just for her rescue from that long-ago auction block, but for everything that had followed: the patient building of trust, the gradual awakening of love, the family they had created together, and the legacy they would leave behind. From the darkest moment of her life had come its greatest blessing, proof that even in the wild and often cruel West, justice, compassion, and love could still prevail.